welcome to the Find Your Ancestor session for today. I'm Katie Stope. I'm the local history librarian here at Appleton Public Library. So thanks for joining us for both in person for our in-person folks and our virtual folks. So it's our first time doing a hybrid one of this. It's been 5 years since we've had a building that we can be able to do it in. So I'm excited to welcome you all back into the library. I hope you've had a chance to roam around the library and see all the wonderful spaces. But if not, you might not know the restrooms are located just outside of the room. If you turn to the left, right outside of the elevators, there's two restrooms there, or a whole bank of restrooms just across from the steps. So if you need to go, that's where you go. Before we get started, a big thanks to the Friends of the Appleton Public Library for supporting our Find Your Ancestors series. We definitely couldn't do this without their support. We host these sessions monthly with upcoming programs on April 12th, featuring Catherine Wilson, who is going to be sharing more than 120 tips and sources for finding family photos online and offline. And then on May 10th, we're going to welcome Dana Kelly from Madison. She's going to discuss uncovering hidden roots with your DNA. So both those sessions, again, will be hybrid, so you can join us in person in the library or virtually on Zoom. We also offer another genealogy series called the Genealogy Jumpstart. It's on select Tuesdays at 1 o'clock Central. So this month, we're going to have 2 sessions. We're going to cover birth and death records on March 11th, so this coming Tuesday. And then marriage and divorce records, we're going to do on Tuesday, March 25th. Again, both of those are hybrid, so you're welcome to join in person or on Zoom. You can check out our full events calendar at apl.org to see what other great programs we have coming up. There's also printed calendars for those in the library. You can stop at any of the service desks and they have printed calendars to let you know what's coming up this month. The virtual attendees, you folks can find your registration links for those upcoming programs in your handout. I have posted it in the chat and I'll post it again once I sit back at my computer. You can also download that handout through the reminder email. If you've missed any of our past sessions of our Find Your Ancestors or Genealogy Jumpstart, we are able to record some of them and post them on our YouTube channel, but not all of them are recorded or put there indefinitely. We are recording today's session, so if you do need to head out early or you want to share it with somebody because you thought it was so amazing, you can point them to our YouTube channel. If you have any questions during today's sessions, please use the mic, or we also actually have in-mic speakers in our ceiling where hopefully it would be able to pick up your question and the whole room would be able to hear it. But if not, or for clarity, if you could use the mic, that would be great. For the virtual attendees, there's a Q&A box and you can pop your questions in there. Just a reminder that recording or sharing any part of this presentation without permission from our speaker is prohibited. You're welcome to download a copy or save a copy of the handout, but that's copyrighted, so you're only allowed to use it for your personal use. At the end of today's presentation, if you could take a moment to fill out the surveys, we have some paper copies of the surveys at the back table along with your handout. And the virtual folks, the survey will pop up after you close out of Zoom. Just let us know what you thought of today's presentation. We'd greatly appreciate it. There's also a spot on there that you can let us know your email address so you can sign up for our monthly newsletter that's specifically on local history and genealogy. So now I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. Today we're hosting Jill Swenson, who is going to share her insights on deciphering penmanship and the importance of spelling in genealogy records. Jill is a retired journalism professor and author of a forthcoming book on her family history in northern Minnesota. So welcome, Jill.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. So, deciphering penmanship and why spelling matters. I'm going to give you an overview here of what we're going to cover. Primarily research methods. Ooh, is that too loud? Suddenly I was getting feedback from myself. We'll talk about finding those source materials, in other words, search strategies, and also evaluating and corroborating source materials. We're also going to talk about primary sources. And what do I mean by primary versus secondary or tertiary? meaning that they're original sources rather than news reports of something that happened. That's a secondary source. Or a tertiary source is an encyclopedia or a reference book, right? Primary sources are those that are, shall I say it, human authored in this age of artificial intelligence, right? They're original documents. And primary sources still require the researcher corroborate the validity and the veracity of the material. We're also going to talk about penmanship, handwritten documents and where to find them, and then how to read them. And I'm going to also include some examples of books which resulted from stories held by handwritten documents. We're also going to talk about spelling matters, not only for search engines, but you all know this, getting someone's name right, it matters. So I'm also going to talk about popular history. As you may not know, I am a former academic, some say a recovering academic. My approach, however, is not. It's not technical or specialized in approach. Even though I have a PhD, I take this popular approach because no one ever reads those kinds of history books. No one seems interested anymore. I'm interested in the people's history and storytelling techniques that are intended for a much wider audience. I'm not a genealogy expert. Yeah, I do have a PhD from the University of Chicago. In fact, Kathy Anderson, who's sitting here, boy, talk about history. She remembers when I first enrolled in 1980, right? I was also, or I have been a literary agent and continue to be a developmental editor. And I'm going to refer to several client projects that have been published as illustrative cases of how doing genealogical research and working with handwritten notes can lead to some interesting discoveries. But the reason I'm going to talk about penmanship and spelling is because of my own amateurish role as a family historian. I am the great-granddaughter of Swedish immigrant homesteaders on Red Lake Indian Reservation land. When my mother died in 2014, I returned to Lake of the Woods in Minnesota, where Mom grew up and I spent my childhood vacations. If you're looking at the map, let's see if I can use my arrow on my, oh, yes, does that work? Yes. So Warroad here is on the Minnesota side. This is the Canadian border. This is that little chimney at the top of Minnesota. You may not recognize, but most of that is water. And the Canadian border crosses here. It's a fluid border, literally, right? And so this is the area just east of Warroad is where my great-grandparents homesteaded. That's their original log cabin. And you'll see up here, this is right in Red Lake Reservation land. So in my research, trying to figure out what happened back then, how'd they get there, what happened? I had to rely primarily on primary sources, including oral histories and interviews. And the majority of written documents were handwritten during the settlement era, right? Not typewritten, handwritten. So where in the world do you find these things? Boy, and they can be all different kinds of things, not just diaries, right? But letters, journals, inventories, notes, inscriptions in things, right? Remember when Mom used to write your name in your clothes, right? That's handwritten. That too, you have to decipher. Or along the kitchen door where the initials of children and how tall they were at certain ages, right? All of these personal and family ephemera that might include handwritten documents, but not just personal stuff, also business correspondence, legal correspondence, ledgers, inventories, minutes of meetings, school board meetings, legal correspondence, most deeds, almost all treaties, right? They're all handwritten. And where can you find them? Boy, Most of you have some of them in your attic or in your basement, right? In personal effects, when someone dies, you often come across these materials and you're like, now what do I do with this? Right? But also, those are often donated to local and historical state historical societies. University of Iowa, for example, has the most world-class collection of women who lived on the prairie who kept diaries. Yours could be in there. You have to kind of, right? But digging for them, right, through archives, museums, even in estate sales, never overlook a garage sale. You won't believe what you find. Rare book dealers, antique dealers, even private collections of letters, right? All of these are places where you can discover pretty interesting things. I want to give you some examples of how those can lead to places. So I don't know if you've read Marcel's letters. It's a popular book club selection here in the Midwest. Came out in 2017. Carolyn Porter is a graphic designer who was trying to create a cursive font and was looking for the right specimen to base the letters on, the alphabet on. And she found in an antique shop in Stillwater these lovely, lovely letters. And she just thought, oh, these must be love letters. And she didn't speak French, and she designed this great font, and it started winning international awards. And then she thought, maybe I should get the backstory here, and had the French translated. And through a process of translation and then further discovery, uncovered a story about Marcel Huse, who had been a Catholic French metal worker who had been conscripted by the Nazis to work in a Daimler factory in Berlin during World War II. And these were letters to his wife and daughters living hiding in the Parisian countryside. Led to an interesting book, right? Just from these handwritten letters. So even though she was interested in the aesthetic, right? What is in the penmanship is a message from the past, human authored. Another example is Death of an Assassin. Anne Marie Ackerman, who is an American raised in Indiana, became a lawyer and lived in Washington State, ended up marrying a German, moved to Germany. Well, she's also been an ornithologist all of these years as her hobby, and writes about birds, and was doing research in her new home and came across a historic forester's journal, which led her to solve the mystery of the murder of a mayor in Germany by a man who fought with Robert E. Lee. He escaped Germany, he escaped conviction. Right? And so in Washington, D.C., they had a reward given to the American descendants of the forester. That was in 2016. So handwritten documents, right? A forester's notebook. All of these things we come across, and they contain some interesting secrets. This guy was my code to the secrets of the Homestead era in Warroad, Minnesota. This is pretty easy to read. It's a signature, Charles A. Moody, Notary Public, Roseau County, Minnesota. It's the first time I ran across his name when he was just a notary. He moved to the Roseau County era and led the efforts to annex unceded territory, Indian territory, into Roseau County. And it happened, and somehow the governor allowed it to happen, right? So I've now discovered a potential land claim that Red Lake Reservation may have against the state of Minnesota, right? By looking at these old county records that he kept, right? He was a customs agent. He was a notary public. He became the county auditor. He was a business partner in the Warroad Town Site Company. He was the first school board president. He was a hotel proprietor. And he was a real estate agent. His handwriting is all over the place. And so I had to figure out how to decipher it because there was lots of stuff that he wrote that I couldn't make heads or tails of. So there are challenges to deciphering penmanship, and yours may be different than mine, right? One big challenge is a language other than English. And given my great-grandparents came from Sweden, and the people who lived in this area of Red Lake Reservation spoke a dialect of Ojibwe, I had a couple of challenges, right? There's also the challenge of translations versus transliterations. This distinction is important. A translation is taking, for example, a sentence in Swedish and translating to what it means in the English language. A transliteration is taking a sentence in another language and trying to keep its phonetic pronunciation to certain words. So you'll see this as we get into spelling matters as well, because transliterations are like phonetic spellings in some ways, okay? There's also the real challenge that it might be written in a different script. Now, it could be Chinese, it could be Arabic, it could be Hebrew, it could, right? There are lots of different scripts than the Roman script most of us are familiar with. You know, Sweden and Germany changed their script during those time periods as well. Right, so it can look like a foreign language to you, even though you understand the language, right? There are other challenges like shorthand. This is a sample of shorthand. I have notebooks that my mother has filled, right, when she was working at Honeywell. Pads and pads and pads of them. And by the way, if you go to any stationery store, the cheapest notepads you can find are now the shorthand notepads. They're still selling them at a discount, right? But shorthand was a method of handwriting that pretty much has fallen aside once the dictaphone arrived. Remember the dictaphone, right? These changes in technology. But will there be anybody around who can read shorthand? I can't. I've tried, right? It's not important enough for me to spend that time looking at those, right? But there may be those who are encountering shorthand. There may be other kinds of coded messages, whether it's slang or a vernacular phrase or an idiomatic expression that you may not be familiar with that has been written into a message. You know, it could be, you know, real code, secrets, you know, maybe, is it written in satire? Right there, that's hard to read some messages. There may be simply phonetic transcriptions where they have written down a word they heard but have no idea what it means. Guilty. I've done that, right? So that there may be errors in the message itself, that it has no secret code to it, or maybe there is, right? I love these letters in which I'm working with an author now, right? After World War I, they were both bereaved, and there was a customary 1.5 years before you could remarry. But this couple, mourning couple, each had lost a partner, one to the flu, one to the war, and they corresponded by love letter, but nobody could know that they had this meeting and that they were gonna, right? So they had to be coded in their letters. Handwriting is not gonna disappear. All right, oops. Challenges, oh, not before I get to this one, right? Sorry, I got my pages out of order here. I want to talk about 2 methods that were primarily used in America. Most of you are probably dealing with American handwritten records. The Spencerian script of the 18th and 19th century, and then the Palmer method, which is pretty much the 20th century. Right, looks very different. I remember learning in 3rd grade this cursive method, right? The teacher, Mrs. Swenson, set it to music. We were supposed to get in the flow of writing. Each of us have our memories of what it was like to learn cursive writing. But if we go back to this one specimen. You'll notice this is written in the turn of the century, right as the Spencerian method was being usurped by this new method, the Palmer method. Right, so it's not like the early 1800s with the big curly cues, but it's also not as clear as what you may be familiar with the Palmer method. So that means, you got to get to know who the writer is and what their style of penmanship is. And, I don't know how many people trust it, but they say penmanship reveals the personality. Everybody has a distinctive form of penmanship. So I want to talk about some strategies to decipher, right? If you come across a document, first identify the words that you recognize right away. It's like code, right? A cipher, you're going to decode it. And then I suggest you create specimens, especially from those words that you understand clearly, of each letter and the variations that are used of that letter in what you can understand, right? This becomes a micro approach to analyzing their handwriting. Upper, lowercase, create the whole alphabet in the words that you can understand. And then you can begin to go back to those words you don't understand and say, I see how he makes his E's sometimes this way when they're connected to this one. This is what this word is, right? Another way is to trace the handwriting itself, put a piece of tracing paper over it and copy it, right? Until you get the flow of it. So you know exactly, you can feel how those letters were coming out of their hand. And finally, sometimes you simply have to consider the purpose of the message for clues to the relevant vocabulary. If it's a letter to their mother, right, there's going to be a very different kind of vocabulary used than if it is a legal deed. Right? So that the language may be associated with the purpose of the letter, and you may be able to make some good guesses, if not with certainty. At least you'll get a sense of what's happening here. Because to be perfectly honest, if we're going to keep moving into the future, those handwritten documents are going to be more and more valuable. They're not going to disappear, and handwriting won't either. Penmanship will persist. Whether or not anybody can read it, right, depends upon interest in the purpose of finding those handwritten documents and what we use them for. The history of communications technology is something I'm really interested in, not just from an academic perspective, but from a personal perspective. We can easily dispel most of the, what I call pearl clutching, or in my case, teeth gnashing, about handwriting and where it is today. When Gutenberg invented the printing press, I hate to tell you, but the people could read the Bible themselves, but the Pope didn't disappear. Priests were still necessary, right? And I think the Pope still reigns in Rome. When typewriters became available, pencils didn't disappear either. They didn't become obsolete. Television didn't mean the death of radio. What changes over time is how people interact with those technologies. What do they use these tools for? Right, that begins to help us think about how handwriting is going to change over time. What we write by hand isn't what people wrote by hand 100 years ago. Fewer handwritten personal documents are sent through a postal system today than email messages by far. Think about what you write by hand. How has it changed during your lifetime? And in the future, how will these human authored artifacts be evaluated or corroborated? Will they become more precious as they become rare? I don't have the answers, but I think there is interesting questions to contemplate. And I think if you want to know more, this is the best book I've read on the subject, which is Anne Truman's book, The Future and Uncertain History of Penmanship. Oh, sorry. You're seeing my... There we go. See? Haven't done this in a long time. So strategies. Wait, did I do this? No. Next one, strategies. So if you can't figure out every word, You have to broaden your strategies, right? Keep reading is the most important one. Keep reading of that same person's handwriting if there's more samples available. The more familiar you become with it, the easier it becomes to read. I can read Charles Moody like I can read my own mother's handwriting now, right? So familiarity, keep reading. The other clue is to look for broader context. What can you infer from the meaning of certain words or phrases that you can figure out, where else can I find out more information about that? So if it's a deed, for example, or it might be giving the description of the land, well, there might be maps that have clearer explanations, and you can begin to corroborate on where exactly, oh, here, I see that wasn't an NE, that was really a northeast, right? Certain things can help you corroborate what the words mean, not just what they say. You can also do comparisons. Look at other handwriting specimens from the same period or from the same place, right? You may run across words that someone else has written clearly that are in your document that you couldn't understand. And finally, look for corroborating evidence. And not when I say corroborating evidence, it's always circumstantial and situational to your family, when and where they were, that you could look for those clues that say, yeah, it was cloudy on April 13th in 1874. I can fact check that, right? Just that corroboration makes you know, I can trust what Grandma wrote. Right? So let's move on to spelling manners. Kakagisic. This is a photograph that was taken in 1958 by a Department of Conservation photographer. And it's been on postcards. They still sell them in Warroad at the Trading Post, right? Because Kakagisic was quite a well-known figure in town. He was a medicine man who lived to the age of 124. You'll notice all the different spellings I've encountered. Yeah, makes searching fun, right? Because not only you have to think about the different spellings, but whether or not there are hyphens between those morphemes or not, right? It makes the search strategy challenging. In fact, this week I was searching online and I found something that otherwise I would have never encountered, but both names that I were looking for happened to be misspelled. So it hadn't come up in any of my searches, but it was through a different method that I ran across this article, right? So sometimes you have to type in the misspellings in your search strategies as well. Spellings can change over time, not just the names of persons, right? I think about Sioux, S-I-O-U-X. We don't use that word much anymore, Sioux. We use Dakota or Oseti Sakowin, right? We don't talk about consumption anymore. We talk about tuberculosis, right? So names change, spellings change. In this day and age of search and find online data surfing, you can overlook some really important data if you don't consider variations in spellings, whether unintentional typos, nicknames, aliases, right? Everlasting sky is the English name for Kakagisic, right? But another word that has changed over time is Ojibwe. Right? I learned Ojibwe as Ojibway. Oops, I've got these out of order again. How did I do this? There we go. My apologies here. Here it is. But you know what I learned when I was a kid? The word was Chippewa. Chippewa. Chippewa, right? There are all these different spellings. But there are real limitations and complications here because I don't know the Ojibwe language. And apparently not a lot of other people did either, right? So there's a lot of transliterations where they tried to put into English letters what they heard someone say, right? So Ojibwe, right, is Chippewa, and the word Chippewa is actually a term that was used by other tribes to describe this tribe. It means puckered toes, describing the kind of moccasins they wore, which were puckered on top of the foot. It's now been changed to Ojibwe, Ojibwe, instead of W-A-Y at the end. They refer to themselves as Anishinaabe. Sort of means we the people. I was kind of embarrassed that I didn't know that the Chippewa and the Ojibwe were the same thing. Right, in college, I took these classes in which I studied these books. Right? How could I not have known or understood the history? That these were the same people. Right? It's embarrassing, but being embarrassed isn't enough unless I learn the lesson in this mistake, which is that I didn't learn or know the history. I read the books, but the history wasn't in there. It had been erased, right? This was the 70s and 80s. And we're just now really understanding what that history of American government relations were with Native nations. We're trying to make sense of what that history is. And what, for me, what that looked like on the ground for my great-grandparents who were on someone else's land. How did that happen? And it happened so peacefully. This is a different story than what I was told in the history books, right? It's a very interesting idea that even in the language I'm using, the name I call them, Ojibwe, Chippewa, is infused with the values of a colonialist system. England is English. The word I dominates the English language. It's a noun-based language. Ojibwe is a verb-based language. The word I is almost never used. I is defined as I am my relatives within a 7 generation. I am the son or daughter of my father. I am the grandson of, I am the great-grandson. I am the father of, or I am the mother of. That's who your name is. That's what your identity is. Very different. You can't get outside of language. In all the records I found out about Kakagisic, one thing was consistently reported. He never spoke or wrote the English language. All my relatives learned English. And in fact, the schools in Warroad were built in order to eradicate other foreign languages. You didn't speak Swedish at home. You didn't speak German at home. English became a language of domination and uniformity and conformity. While researching the family history, now I've got these completely out of order, 27. How did I meet these challenges? You know, when Kakagisic learned Ojibwe language in 1844, it was a different form of the language than what is spoken now. The language is now endangered, right? I needed help. I also needed help understanding what this history was. And so I did a lot of interviewing with people who lived in the community, who were still alive. And they also gave me access to their documents, their personal documents. That was tremendously helpful. The local historical society was also extraordinarily helpful. Most of the material was not available online. I'm going to repeat that because it's so hard, right? We're all searching at home in our offices. Go to the local historical archives to find things, not only to find primary documents, but to talk to those people who know that local history. Like Katie Stilp, if you're working on, right, local history and family history here in the Fox Cities. Again, the local public library, and in fact, in Warroad and in Roseau, the public library and the local museum is in the same building. Right? Not big buildings, but they are paired. And so there's a relationship that happens and records, whoa, sorry, jumped that head. Record specialists are also very helpful. Genealogical societies, state historical societies, translators. I worked with a lot of translators. Anton Troyer, who teaches at Bemidji State, who really founded the language immersion program on Red Lake to make the elders accessible to every school child. They're integrated into the classrooms. And so the language immersion program there has been tremendous. And subject area specialists, right? Whatever it is that your family's dealing with, find experts in the area to help you make sense of what you discovered. I couldn't discover this alone. Once you get all of this information, I can't tell what number slide this is. This is my out of order pages without putting page numbers on things. Isn't it terrible? Here we go. Piecing together the stories. I always say focus on the story. There isn't one big long saga, 1,000-page book to be done. Start with a short story, an anecdote, a family story that you can wrap your head around. It might be just grandma's chocolate cake recipe and all of your memories associated with it. It doesn't have to be, right, the entire family tree with starting in 1700 and going to the present. Work on little pieces, profiles of individuals that you've found in your family tree, vignettes of public events, right? Did they attend the World's Fair in 1964 as a family? Oh, there's a lot of research on the World's Fair. And your memories from relatives who were there at that moment, you can write an incredible story for your next generation to understand what that experience meant to your family. There are stories which may not be yours to tell, at least not in public. You can find them out. And some of you already know this if you're doing family history. You are the keeper of the stories, right? You'll know. And people can come to you to find out. But if they're still living, if their descendants are unaware of personal disclosures in a handwritten document, you may want to be careful about publication. Right? It may not be your story to tell. And that becomes the question. If you're going to write, right, do you wait until you finished all your research? Heck no. You got to start as soon as you got some research and you're like, oh, I think I figured something out. Write down what you think you figured out. Begin writing then, because it's in the writing process that the evaluation of the veracity and the validity of your materials really comes to your front. You have to figure out, hey, these two things don't jive. Oh, that date and that date are wrong. That couldn't have happened at that time because this was happening. Right? You don't figure that out until you start writing the story. Otherwise, you're just amassing data. And there's a huge difference in trying to make sense of what you've got. You have to look for the story. And I'll tell you what, as soon as you sit down to write, it leads to more reading and more research, which then eventually leads to more writing. So it's an iterative process. I want to take you through this sort of corroborating sources a bit more, because I know it's always hard. It's like, how would I do that? How would I corroborate? right? I'm happy to talk at more length in the Q&A about it, but I think that there's a really important point to be made here, which is you must assess the validity. Is this really the document that it pertains to be? In the same way, if someone drew a piece of art, right, you have to establish its provenance. Could someone have forged this? Was it done later? Right, all of those kinds of questions about validity, but also the veracity. Is this truthful? Is it credible? Is it reliable? Who is this source? Can you really trust they would say it? What was their motive in saying it? What was their perspective? Their perspective may have been more limited than yours so many years later with, hindsight is 20/20, right? People don't often see things that you think they should see in the moment. Corroboration is how you evaluate the evidence, right? Trying to establish with some other points in reality that this actually happened. In trying to do that, you go down some really interesting rabbit holes, and I want to share one of those rabbit holes I've been down with you. I'm reading handwritten accounts of finding their way to the homestead, a family near Roseau, Minnesota. And I read that this family got lost. Of course, they'd never been to their homestead before, right? It's just a place on a map. And they're finding their way and they get lost and they stop at a cabin in the woods and they knock on the door and a Black man opens the door in Minnesota in 1909. Huh? Right? I was like, what? And there's no further reference. I was like, what? I had to go down that rabbit hole. I couldn't figure out what he would be doing there at that time. Well, get ready for a story. Billy turns out to have been a member of the Black fur trading family who worked for the American Fur Company. John Jacob Astor, that guy. Billy helped establish the trading post in Warroad in 1820. The photo here points to where this rabbit hole is headed. That picture is of Marguerite Bonga, his aunt, and Jacob Falstrom, also known as Ozawindib. We'll get there. He was the first Swede in Minnesota. More on that soon. Based on the handwritten letters that have recently been found and transcribed of George Bonga, Billy's uncle, it turns out there's a much more complete picture of this dynasty family in these handwritten journals and correspondence. It goes back to Jean and Marie Bonga, who had been enslaved in Southern Africa and spoke no English, but spoke French. Little is known of their passage from Africa, but the president and founder of Macalester College claims that they had arrived on Mackinac Island in 1782 as slaves of Captain Daniel Robertson, a British officer. During the Revolutionary War, the British had built a fort on the island of Mackinac. In the straits between Michigan and Huron, Mackinac Island had been a strategic military asset. That's when the Brits controlled it, not the US. Before he departed in 1787 for Montreal, Captain Robertson emancipated Jean and Marie Jean Bonga. The Bongas went on to open the first hotel and tavern on Mackinac Island, a major hub in the fur trade. And it's where John Jacob Astor decided to build his residential palace. Before long, their son Pierre Bonga became a prominent fur trader, and he married an Ojibwa woman who'd been born on Rabbit Lake near Brainerd. They had 6 children, one of whom was Marguerite Bonga. Marguerite Bonga married a fur trader named Jacob Falstrom, aka Ozawindib, a Swede. I'm but one of many descendants of the 1.3 million Swedes who came to the United States between 1850 and 1950. A growing population, Less farmland, repeated crop failures, pushed Swedes to emigrate as much as free land, big timber, and opportunity pulled them to America. Today, Minnesota has the largest population of Swedish Americans in the United States. But who was the first Swede in Minnesota? Jacob Falstrom. Like Alice in Wonderland, I felt like I was growing smaller and my world was getting bigger. Jacob Falstrom was born in Stockholm. Young Jacob became a cabin boy and left on a ship his uncle captained, headed for England. According to legend, the ship crashed and young Jacob survived, but his uncle did not. By the age of 12, he had found his way to London. In the summer of 1807, he had set sail on an expedition to Hudson Bay with Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk from Scotland. Lord Selkirk sought to secure a new location to establish a Scottish colony. It's also called Rupert's Land. After Jacob arrived at the Hudson Bay trading post, he walked out into the wilderness to go hunting and ended up getting lost. He'd gone 8 days without food when an Ojibwe woman found him and took him in. She named him Ozawindib. In Ojibwe, it means yellowhead. Yet Jacob Falstrom learned her language, her dress, her customs, and Lord Selkirk returned to Scotland without him. But he came back in 1811 after the Hudson Bay Company granted him more than 100,000 square miles, an area 5 times larger than Scotland, to establish an agricultural settlement in this region, which included Lake of the Woods. Rupert's Land became known as the Assiniboia District, and on the roster of those listed in residence in the Selkirk settlement in 1812 appears the name of Jacob Falstrom. And you see, this is where, let's see if I can get the mouse, here we go. Right down here, whoops. Okay, here's the Great Lakes. Here we go. Right in here. This is Hudson Bay. He comes down through here, and I'm going to go to the next slide so you can, whoop. That's the 1812 slide, hang on. You'll see a little bit further on exactly where in Warroad this is, right? This is an etching of the Hudson Bay, or of the American Fur Company. The Hudson Bay Company had gotten a little mean with some of their fur traders as the Métis population had become more dominant. And the Métis are those who had, the Scottish who had married Ojibwe women. So they were biracial, and they became an intermediary caste between the Ojibwe and the French fur traders. And the Ojibwe were being pushed out. And so they switched to the American Fur Company on this side of the border, which America wanted to stop the British from trading with the French fur traders. So this was all in the patriotic motive here for moving to the American side of the border. In 1820, this is an etching of Duluth, which at this time was called Fond du Lac. Ozawindib traveled as a fur trader northwest to Lake of the Woods, along the Rainy River, all the way down to Lake Superior. He portaged all the way down the state along the St. Croix River and back up to Duluth. He knew Swedish, he knew English, he learned French, he spoke Ojibwe, Cree, Dakota, and several Haudenosaunee languages. Following the Treaty of 1818, the border between the United States and British North America was redrawn. So in that previous map, you see Rupert's Land came all the way down here, most of the upper quadrant of North Dakota and the upper northwest part of Minnesota, what would become Minnesota. The line, the border was redrawn, and the line goes along the 49th parallel. The British Crown agreed to cede this territory to the United States. When the border lines were redrawn, it made Jacob Falstrom now the first Swede in Minnesota, 40 years before it actually became a state. It's on the US side. Given his travels to and from company headquarters in Fond du Lac, It's likely Jacob Falstrom met Marguerite Bonga through her father and brother in the fur trade. Ozawindib continued to expand his route and traveled south to Bedote, where the waters gather at the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers in what is now present-day Minneapolis. You may remember Zebulon Pike, right? U.S. Brigadier Zebulon Pike established a military fort there in 1805. Pike had been sent on orders from D.C. to stop the British from further land acquisition in these Northwest territories and to curtail their influence in the fur trade. So after the borders were redrawn, the mission of the fort changed. It was to prevent white settlers from further land encroachment into Indian territories before treaty agreements were signed. I had not known that. Pike claimed the sacred land near the confluence of the rivers for his initial military fortification, and construction began in 1820 on the permanent structures at what was then called Fort St. Anthony and is now named Fort Snelling. It was renamed in 1825. You may recall Dred Scott was at Fort Snelling. Schoolcraft, which we're going to get to, is the next character, comes into play in Fond du Lac. During Jacob Falstrom's time, he's had a contract with the federal government to supply wood to the military fort. And he had a contract to provide mail service from the fort north to Lake Superior and points northwest to Fond du Lac. It's interesting to contemplate that Dred Scott was at Fort Snelling imprisoned and enslaved, while Mr. Bonga and Marguerite Bonga and her husband were traveling freely as an interracial couple, providing services to the US government. Didn't anticipate finding this part of history either. What's interesting is who they run into. Remember this guy? I remember him from history class, right? He claimed to have discovered the source of the Mississippi River. Oh gosh, the national newspapers covered his big expedition. It turns out George Bonga, this was in the letters that were recently found and published, he recommended his brother-in-law, Ozawindib, to be his guide on this canoe expedition to find the headwaters. Schoolcraft met George Bonga in Duluth in 1820. I know this because in his travel journals, again handwritten, he thought it remarkable enough to take note of meeting a successful Black fur trader in the wilderness. Schoolcraft had asked him for an Indian guide to escort him up the Mississippi by canoe. At no point does Schoolcraft ever mention Ozawindib is a Swede. It's in none of the newspaper accounts published en route, nor in his journals, nor in his books. Nowhere does he ever admit that it was Falstrom who knew him, who knew exactly where to take him, because the Ojibwa had shown him where it had always been. Right. Why spelling matters. Oh, that Ozawindib, Jacob Falstrom thing, right? I think this is one example of why spelling matters, right? Even aliases, right? Spellings change over time. Like Chippewa, Ojibwe, Ojibwa. I found one last week, 2 weekends ago when I was in Minneapolis. I drove out in Stillwater and there is a street spelled, it's pronounced Ojibwa. It's spelled O-T-C-H-I-P-E. It's like another variation, right? But it's pronounced exactly the same. The spellings change, even though the word remains the same. The names of persons who you are writing about may need corroboration. It took more than 100 years for scholars to figure out Ozawindib was Jacob Falstrom. In the references sections, which I'm leaving you at the end here with, there's a book which makes those connections explicit based on these new documents, which have come to light and piecing all of this together. Place names vary within a community and across time. Fond du Lac is a city not too far south from here, right? But that was the name that was used for the city of Duluth for more than a century. Asking people how they want their name to be spelled does so much more than make an accurate record. It's a matter of respect, and asking is probably the most important thing you can do if you decide to go public. In other words, to publish family history results. It matters to people how you spell their name. It matters how they prefer other words to be spelled that are associated with their family story, even sometimes word choices. As a former journalism professor, I have always advised my students, ask first. Forgiveness is a bitch to ask later. Ask first, because it always leads to more information. They're going to tell you more. You're going to get it right instead of being the enemy of the people. Spelling errors and other kinds of mistakes, owning those errors can take you down really interesting rabbit holes you might not otherwise have found. This doesn't make it into this book, this whole story about the first Swede in Minnesota. This was just a rabbit hole, but boy, did it change the way I think about that time period in which my great-grandparents lived and settled in this land. And that notion that, I'm sorry, the Swedish race is the Puritan Aryan race, right, descendant all the way. There's a lot of complicated history we've got to unpack yet. We have all been related. We are all kin. And it's important to research not just our own, but those we don't yet know. I'm going to leave you with the references here in your handout, and I'm going to open it up for questions. And should I take this off this mode? Okay, good. Then you can't see my big face. Yes.
I have letters from the early 1930s that my grandparents received from relatives that were living in Russia, but they were in the German part of Russia. But anyway, my mother had tried to get them deciphered. Apparently they're German, but there's some different kind of German, different script than you had thought. But my grandparents got the letters for years, and then all of a sudden stopped, like in 1933.
Mm-hmm.
For anything yet. And of course, there were wars. But anyway, my mom tried to find somebody to translate these, and I know that's probably really different the way you talk.
No, that's exactly the kind, yeah. No, figuring out whether it's Russian or German, and if it's German, is it in a dialect or a style that's specific to a place, right? There are different kinds, the Schwabish, right, which is a dialect of German, and there's Bavarian dialect, right? So, right, all of those things are very important. Working with a specialist who works with the German language may be able to help you. Now, well, I'm guessing you could even start with our local high schools. I have to confess that I was on the first Appleton East Exchange program with the German Club in 1975. And the East High School German program has always been exceptional. They still go to the same high school every year, right? But the high school German teacher may be able to help you. Lawrence University has a German department. The University of Wisconsin has a linguistics department. So finding a person who can help you figure out which language it is, but again, finding someone who would translate, typically translators are paid professionals. Okay, in fact, that's what Marcel's letter, she didn't speak French. She hired a woman who had lived through World War II, who was in her community. And I think she called the French there's a French language radio program in Minneapolis that airs, and she called the station and said, trying to find somebody to help me translate letters, and got a referral that way. So find an expert in German language. Kathy has a suggestion.
Modern technology, like with Babel and stuff like that, could you put particular words in?
Well, I haven't tried that. I can't tell what it says.
The script is so difficult.
Take a picture of it and put it into some kind of AI program that might be.
Because it's modern, meaning 20th century, I don't think it would be difficult to find someone to translate. Uh-huh. Well, show me afterwards, because I speak German. Okay.
So now I'm trying.
I love it. That's great.
Like my grandmother's sibling. No, he did not come. Never did come, and when the letters stopped, they never heard anything from him again. They figured they.
Yeah. Although there's a lot more information now that is available about Prussian descendants and even Russian descendants. The Eastern European databases have become a bit more open.
The city, they were born in Russia, but actually that city's in Ukraine now.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Good luck. But they may be Ukrainian now that you say it. I think so. I bet you can find someone here locally. See me afterwards.
We have an online question, wondering if anybody has any good references for Polish writing.
Oh. Is this from Elizabeth Reinecke? I'm feeling pressure. Elizabeth Reinecke is the author of Chasing Portraits, who I worked with a great-granddaughter's search for her lost art legacy. Her great-grandfather was an artist in Warsaw in the interwar years. And while he perished in the concentration camps, his art had been hidden all over the city. And after the war, was lost until she began to start searching for it. And good guides to Polish language. No, there are no good guides. This is part of the problem. There are good specialists in this area. Again, I would seek out experts in Polish language. But it's interesting because, you know, spellings with Polish, for example, names. I just want to bring this in because it's relevant to what we were talking about. My friend Kim Hruba is married to a Czech man whose last name is Hrubi, right? Like in Polish and in Czech, your last name may be gendered. So the spelling will vary, right? I don't have a good single source. My apologies.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, college and university offers.
The person said, yeah, it's extremely difficult. Another question, someone's wondering, when there are several spellings of a name that are found in various documents, how do you decide which one to use? Are some records more accurate than others, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think every writer has to make those decisions themselves within a framework of the style guides that you plan to publish for. So if you're just circulating this among family and friends, it's quite different than if you're publishing this in, you know, an academic article or in a magazine or a local newspaper. What was the question again? I got sidetracked there.
It was asking, when there are several spellings of a name that are.
Which one to
found in
use?
various documents, how do you decide which one to use?
Yes, so you are the one who has to come up with your own style rule. The only rule of style is consistency, right? And so if you run across there are multiple spellings, which one are you going to use? You gotta pick one and stick with it and use it consistently, right? And I face those very questions about, was I going to use Kakagisic with Kakay, right? Which version? Was I going to use Ojibwe or Chippewa? These were all words during my childhood, etc. All of those questions, I decided to ask those whose names I was going to be using, what they preferred. Because it wasn't only my story anymore. So that was my decision about which way was I going to spell Ojibwe. I wasn't going to be too woke, right? And spell it whatever way I thought, right, was. I was going to use what was relevant in that historical period, given what people told me they preferred the term was, because that's what was used by them and others. Right? But I think asking is a part of that, which way you prefer something to be spelled, but being consistent, and you just have to take a stab at it. I make the decision to use the word Indian. It's not a popular word these days, right? Native American is far more popular, etc. But it's still used in almost all federal documents. It's the language I grew up with, and it's the language I asked those who I'm writing about, are you comfortable with that? Yeah. Right? Others may make different choices, but you're the one who sets up the style rules. You're the writer. As long as you have a rule and you follow it, you might have an argument with an editor, but if the rule is consistent, you're likely to win.
The second half of their question was asking about, certain sources. Are certain sources better than others? So remember, if you have an original source that's something that person wrote and signed their name, well, of course, that's the spelling you're gonna wanna go with, of course, or something that you know that they filled out. It's, an original record that they would have provided their name on. That's the spelling I would go with.
Yes, and it's really tough for a lot of Native American records because oftentimes there is only an X. No option as to what they preferred.
We have another virtual question. This person says, I am 75. In my youth, we had an elderly neighbor, and I thought her first name was Josephine, like Josephine with an I. But the more I try to read old documents, the more I think her name was Josephine with a J, and the handwriting of the time led to that mistake. Would you agree?
I would. Sometimes we have mistakes and we can figure them out and then we move forward.
I think especially that I and J, the way some people write their J's or their I's is,
Yes.
it's up for debate on what the actual letter is.
Yes, and some people make their own letters, right? Different ways. Yeah.
All right, those are all the questions I see, unless there's any other ones in person or virtual, now's your chance.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. Greatly appreciated it. Love being in the new library. Mhm.
All right, everyone, thanks again for joining us this afternoon on our presentation today. We hope to see you next week for our Genealogy Jumpstart program on Tuesday. Again, are we talking all about birth and death records on Tuesday the 11th at 1 o'clock. And then our next Find Your Ancestors will be April 12th. And that will be all about those 120 plus tips and sources for finding family photos offline and online. So if you are one of those people who is searching for a family photo yet, or wants to find more family photos, definitely join us for that. So again, thank you, Jill, for joining us, and thanks everybody, and take care.
Thank you.